Somewhere in a cathedral tower in northern Italy, locked behind glass, sits an old wooden bucket. It's cracked. It's unremarkable. It looks like something you'd find rotting in a barn. And yet, for nearly 700 years, two entire cities have argued over who it truly belongs to. This bucket didn't just get stolen, it started a war. To understand why, you have to go back to the year 1325, to a part of Italy that had no single ruler, no single army, and no shortage of grudges. This was the age of the city-state, when towns like Bologna and Modena weren't provinces of a larger kingdom. They were their own small nations, each with walls, each with pride, and each convinced the other was an enemy waiting to strike. The historian Trevor Dean, who has spent much of his career studying medieval Italian city-states, points out that this period wasn't defined by isolated skirmishes. It was defined by networks of alliance and hostility that could turn a minor insult into a full military campaign almost overnight. Bologna and Modena weren't just neighbors. They belonged to opposing political factions that had been tearing Italy apart for generations: the Guelphs, loyal to the Pope, and the Ghibellines, loyal to the Holy Roman Emperor. Bologna stood with the Guelphs. Modena stood with the Ghibellines. And a border between two loyalties is rarely a peaceful one. By 1325, tension between the two cities had been simmering for years. Small raids, broken treaties, insults passed back and forth through messengers. Then, according to accounts from the period, a group of Modenese soldiers slipped into Bolognese territory on a raid, and somewhere along the way they took something. Not gold, not weapons, a wooden well bucket. Picture that for a second. Soldiers, armed and mounted, riding home with a bucket tied to a saddle like a trophy. To Modena, it was a joke, a jab at Bologna's expense. Look what we took right out from under you. But to Bologna, it wasn't funny at all. It was a public humiliation, a symbol that their rivals could walk into their territory and take whatever they wanted, even something as mundane as a bucket used to pull water from a well. And in a world where a city's reputation was tied directly to its ability to defend itself, humiliation was not something you could simply shrug off. Bologna demanded the bucket back. Modena refused. What followed wasn't a quiet diplomatic standoff. Bologna assembled an army. Historical estimates place it at somewhere around 30,000 men, an enormous force for a regional dispute. Modena, vastly outnumbered, prepared to fight anyway. The two forces met near a place called Zappolino in November of 1325. This wasn't a skirmish, it was a real battle, with real casualties, fought with the same seriousness as any war over land or crowns. And in one of history's more surprising outcomes, the far smaller Modenese army won. Bologna's massive force was routed, soldiers scattered, and when the dust settled, Modena still had the bucket. Here's the detail that historians find almost impossible to fully explain even now. Bologna, humiliated and defeated, never got the bucket back. Modena kept it, not just as a spoil of war, but as a trophy, a taunt frozen in time. They brought it home and eventually placed it inside the bell tower of their cathedral, where, remarkably, it still sits today. Why would a city keep a literal bucket as a monument to a war? Because in the logic of medieval Italy, symbols carried enormous weight. A captured banner, a captured relic, a captured bucket. All of it said the same thing. We beat you, and we want you to remember it forever. The event became so famous that centuries later, in the 1600s, the poet Alessandro Tassoni wrote a mock-heroic poem about it called La Secchia Rapita, or The Rape of the Bucket. The title alone tells you everything about how absurd the story had become in the public imagination. Here was one of the most serious types of conflict a medieval city could face: full military mobilization, real bloodshed, real political consequences, and centuries later, people were writing satire about it, because at its core, the whole thing sounds like something out of a fable. Two cities, 30,000 soldiers, a bucket. But strip away the comedy for a moment, and something more serious sits underneath. This wasn't really a war about a bucket. Historians studying medieval city-state conflict agree that the bucket was never the cause. It was the excuse. Bologna and Modena would likely have gone to war eventually, regardless of what was stolen that day. The rivalry, the political alignment, the decades of hostility, all of it was already primed to explode. The bucket simply gave both sides a reason to point to, a story simple enough for soldiers and citizens alike to understand and rally behind. This is a pattern that shows up again and again throughout history. Wars are rarely started by the thing everyone remembers. They're started by decades of pressure that finally needs a spark, and the spark is often something almost embarrassingly small. A stolen bucket, an insulted ambassador, a disputed border marker. The real causes, alliances, resentments, economic pressure get buried underneath a story simple enough to repeat for 700 years. And that's exactly what happened here. Nobody today remembers the treaties, the shifting alliances, or the political maneuvering between Bologna and Modena in the 1320s. What survived, what got immortalized in a poem, in local legend, in a museum display behind glass, was the bucket. Even now, the rivalry hasn't fully faded. Bologna has, at various points over the centuries, requested the bucket back. Modena has never agreed. The item remains on display in the Ghirlandina Tower, part of Modena's cathedral complex, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, visited by tourists who often have no idea that the cracked wooden object behind the glass once triggered a full medieval war.